Hi, good afternoon on the East Coast. It's actually after almost afternoon on the West Coast, and it's evening in Europe. Thanks so much for joining us for this final webinar um, presentation as part of the ALD Connect newborn screening, non-cerebral ALD monitoring phase boot camp that we're all being part of. If you're lucky enough to watch it live, or if you're lucky enough to catch a recording of this. Um, before we move on, I just want to remind everyone that any of the topics we discuss here during this presentation are not meant to be direct medical advice. We're not favoring certain treatments over others. We're just having an open discussion. Obviously, take the information that's interesting, bring it back to your own clinical team, and discuss if anything we're discussing is right for you. Also, I want to thank everyone for taking time to participate today, not only to be on our panel, but also ALD Connect is so lucky to have so much good community and industry support, and I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank Bluebird Bio for their support and sponsorship of this bootcamp. In this session, we're going to be talking about what's coming next. So we've discussed your ALD diagnosis and creating your clinical team. We've talked about how to handle crucial conversations and getting the information across with family and with others. We've talked about the mental health impact of the disease on relationships, on the patient, and now we're moving on to looking ahead. What's coming next, both in terms of therapeutics and treatments, and also in terms of newborn screening and raising awareness for ALD and getting the legislative support we need to make sure that every baby is tested at birth so that they can join our group and be in this monitoring phase. So today we have Keith Van Haren. He's a doctor at Stanford. He's a neurologist. He's a researcher. He's a member of the ALD Connect Board of Directors. He's everyone. And we also have Miranda McAuliffe, who is representing ALD Alliance, really the folks leading the charge in spreading newborn screening awareness and legislative updates. So I will hand it over to Keith to take it away.
Hey there, great to join everyone today. I encourage everyone, Miranda and I are here to help engage in as much of a discussion as we can with the community. So please feel free to submit your questions. There's a Q&A at the bottom, in the bottom right of your tabs there. So please feel free to submit questions there. Miranda and I will try and follow them as we go along. But the conversation here will cover newborn screening and, as the title suggests, what lies ahead, meaning what to expect in a sense from your newborn screening experience. And I think I can start off a little bit, and then Miranda. So I'll cover some of the treatment questions, and Miranda will cover some of the screening questions on legislation, which states are currently screening, which states are expected to, and probably how to engage and get involved. So I'm in California. Our state's been screening since for several years now, and we are incorporating, I think, pretty familiar standards of care, meaning we are engaging with families right around the time of diagnosis to discuss, genetic testing and biochemical testing, and then soon thereafter, when we confirm the diagnosis or confirm a variant of unknown significance, we will begin screening for adrenal insufficiency and begin screening at the right ages for brain MRIs. And so adrenal insufficiency testing begins almost immediately and continues on a regular basis every 3 to 6 months according to age. That's laboratory based. And then for the screening for neurologic symptoms or neurologic signs, we do that through MRI in the first couple of decades of life. And we screen with MRIs about one MRI every 6 to 12 months, depending on your age. So we don't really begin the first MRI until at least age 1. And then we begin screening with some regularity after that. And then by age 2.5 or 3, we're beginning to screen every 6 months with an MRI. So in terms of what kinds of treatments we're implementing at that age, we have, our conversations will sort of begin with genetic testing and family members and just discuss what this means over the course of life for individuals and families. And to start off with, my general counsel to families is that, they're now part of a new community of people that they may or may not have known about before. And but what to expect for their kids, I think we all, we have kids and we expect, we think in 70-year increments. We think, okay, well, I'm going to have a child, and my child will, go through all the phases of life and all the usual fashions, and they'll go to school, they'll get married, they'll have a job, they'll have kids, and I think when we have a diagnosis like ALD, or other early childhood, diagnoses, it can really toy with that sense of expectation. Like, what does this mean for the mental map I laid out for my child going forward? And for some diagnoses, it comes with lots of uncertainties. So I see kids with a variety of diagnoses. My ALD is the area where I kind of spend or try to spend as much of my time as possible. I see a lot of families with ALD, but also kids with other diagnoses that don't have treatment. And so these early childhood diagnoses for some families do mean something very different for what to expect for their children later in life. For ALD, I actually think that there's a lot to be hopeful for. It's a very scary diagnosis, very serious diagnosis. But my honest counsel to families is that when they're diagnosed with ALD, they need not change their expectations for their child's future. Now that they have been diagnosed early and are part of the newborn screening experience, we should be able to successfully identify any serious complications and treat them ahead of time. So the risk of death or serious neurologic disability due to brain lesions it drops enormously if we know about the diagnosis ahead of time. So if many of the scary images we have of the ALD experience are actually drawn from the past, from before newborn screening, when we would often discover the diagnosis only when patients became symptomatic with severe adrenal insufficiency, which was life-threatening, or severe brain lesions, which had become very large and were often not amenable to treatment, or if they were amenable to treatment, the outcomes were not very good. In the newborn screening experience, expectations really are different. My expectations for my patients and our patients in the newborn screening experience is that they will, have potentially normal lifespan, and that if adrenal insufficiency appears, we'll treat it early, and it will just become a part of life, in the same way that maybe a diagnosis of diabetes is a part of life. It's treatable, it's manageable. And with the appearance of a brain lesion, it is something that if we catch it early, the response with bone marrow transplant or some of the new experimental therapies like gene therapy, the responses really are better. The outcomes are better. When we catch these early through early surveillance with regular MRIs, we catch lesions when they're very small, before they have symptoms, before they cause significant disability, and really, in many cases, before they cause any intellectual setbacks. So kids can go through, I tell families to expect their kids to go to college if that's part of the plan. Expect them to have jobs, get married, and then in terms of what to expect for the later life symptoms of adrenomyeloneuropathy, where you have stiffness and imbalance, in the legs. Right now, the treatments are very modest. We don't have any FDA-approved treatments for it, but that will change in 20 years when the children who are now screened in newborn screening are of age, to begin developing symptoms of adrenomyeloneuropathy. We'll have treatments for it. I think most of us in the community are very confident about that. I think that many of our visions of the future for ALD might be incorrectly rooted in the visions of the past. And I think that if you are joining the ALD community now through newborn screening, vision of the future is really very different. It is very different than our history together. So there's been no shortage of tragedy in the ALD experience in the past, but newborn screening really will change that. So that is part of the context here, and that's often where I begin some of the conversations with families. All right, so I will transition from that note about just a general perspective on what a newborn screening diagnosis of ALD means. I'll maybe chat a little bit about treatment, and then I want to transition over to Maria to talk about newborn screening legislation and engagement and so on. So I'll maybe provide a brief overview of some of the trials that have been recently or ongoing for ALD children. And then I think maybe we can leave it open to some questions, and maybe I'll cover questions if there's some about clinical trials in men for ALD and women for ALD, with ALD. So, okay, so as many of you know, there are what we call natural history studies available for the ALD. And natural history studies are basically a study of what happens over the lifespan when we're just providing standard of care, meaning what happens when there are no new therapies applied. And those are basically families reporting their experience of if and when symptoms occur, what kind of medications they're taking, what the MRI results are, what the adrenal test results are, and so on. Those sound like perhaps unexciting studies. They're probably the most important studies to be done for any rare disease community. They're really the foundation of all the things that we want to know and need to know to understand how to develop new treatments, how to run clinical trials successfully, and so on. So I would strongly encourage any family to engage in these studies. They usually do involve questionnaires. Some of them involve blood draws, but they can often be done in keeping with routine care. And I would really strongly recommend these studies. You can still engage in new treatment trials, even if you're enrolled in one of these natural history studies. None of them will prevent that. So please, I would encourage anyone to get involved in natural history studies, and the ALD Connect website can help connect you with those natural history studies. So what about interventional trials where we have new treatments? So interventional trials would be trials where we have a drug or some new exciting device or something to be tested, where the question is, will this drug or device improve some measure of disease? And right now, most of those studies are centered, for children, are going to be centered around either preventing or treating brain lesions. And I expect in the future we'll be looking at studies preventing or treating adrenal insufficiency as well. But right now those studies are further off in the distance, I think. So prevention and treatment of brain lesions is a topic of great interest in the ALD community. As many of you know, the current standard of care for identifying brain lesions is through MRI. And so when we identify brain lesions on the MRI, we can then proceed to the standard of care with bone marrow transplant, which is very effective, especially if you have a good, a good donor match. So the donor would come from a sibling or just a kind of an anonymous donor in a database, and the children go through a bone marrow transplant, which can take 1 or more months in the hospital. So it is a pretty serious procedure. It involves pretty significant medications, including chemotherapies, that basically eliminate the existing bone marrow, and then you replace it with new bone marrow or stem. It's really hematopoietic stem cells is the other term for that. So when we replace the bone marrow with new bone marrow cells, or what we call new hematopoietic stem cells, they can take the place of the old cells and help. If we understand it, they travel into the brain lesions. So they go to the bone marrow, and they also go into the brain lesions, and they essentially kind of repair the leaky brain barrier, blood-brain barriers, and they kind of stop the process of inflammation in the brain. And that is generally very effective when we have when we catch the lesions early and we have a good match. For patients who don't have a perfect match, like a sibling match donor, gene therapy trials, the gene therapy trial from Bluebird Bio has been ongoing for some time. It is very recently completed its enrollment target, but I think there's possibility they may open up again in the future to more enrollees, and the hope is we'll have that. We all hope that it will meet FDA criteria for approval. We don't know yet, but we're optimistic. But currently, that therapy uses a patient's own hematopoietic stem cells. So basically, you take off the patient's blood cells, you put them in the laboratory, and then you insert a new gene, insert a new ABCD1 gene, and you essentially do the bone marrow transplant. You use the chemicals to eliminate the patient's old bone marrow, and you put in the new genetically modified cells from the patient that you had taken out earlier. And those cells can then, grow and do something very similar to what a donor themselves can do. And so far, I think it's fair to say the results that have been published look quite promising, and it looks like a pretty good therapy. And so it also has kind of a lower risk of what's called graft versus host disease, which is like an autoimmune form of response when you have someone else's blood, what immune cells provided to you. There's a bit of a, they've kind of have a disagreement, and they've got to sort things out and make sure everyone can eventually get along. The new donor and your the patient's body kind of sort things out over time, but in that early period there can be some pretty significant immune reactions. And when you use the gene therapy where you're using the patient's own cells, you largely avoid that. So that's one of its great advantages. And so that is certainly an area of great excitement and lots of promise. And I think we all acknowledge in the ALD community that we're very fortunate to be one of the very first genetic diseases to have gene therapy. We are, so we are in the later stages of trials for that. I think we're hoping that the data that is collected will be close to or near sufficient for FDA approval. We don't know yet. I don't know. I don't have any secret inside knowledge to know that, and that's really nor does the company. I think they're preparing to engage with the FDA too. So we don't know more about when that will become widely available, but we hope it will at least open up and trials again soon. For other therapies, so there's a company called Minorex that has a chemical that is derived from a diabetes drug. And they've identified this compound. It has some anti-inflammatory and antioxidant capacities, and it modifies metabolism a little bit. And that drug is called Min-102, and it has been through some adult trials with some promising results. It didn't. It's what we call its primary outcomes, meaning, before you start a trial, you decide ahead of time what you're going to commit to as the thing that matters most. That it didn't hit those marks exactly, but it did show some what I and others also thought was some promising data in other areas. And one of the areas that looked promising is that it did seem to suggest that individuals who had brain lesions or risk for brain lesions had some either improvement of brain lesions or slightly lower risk of developing brain lesions. I think there's interest there in understanding whether that was might be biologically true or just a statistical fluke. I think that remains to be seen, but I think there's reason to be optimistic that that will be fruitful in the future. I think there were some side effects with the drug that include, fluid overload, weight gain, that don't look terrible, but I think bear some consideration, and probably won't be widely available for certainly for young people immediately. But there is a trial ongoing in Europe looking at whether this drug can be used for a select number of young people who already have early brain lesions. And so for individuals who do develop early brain lesions that are not yet enhancing, for children with these early brain lesions that are show early signs of developing a brain lesion, but don't show a breakdown in the blood-brain barrier that causes this feature called enhancement, then those patients may be eligible to enroll in this trial, and would involve traveling to Europe to enroll at a site in Europe and staying there for a few months' time, while you can simultaneously proceed with being evaluated for a bone marrow transplant as well. But what they are testing there is whether the drug, this Min-102, can prevent the brain lesions from going from this early stage lesion to a more advanced lesion. And so for families who, this meaning whether you can avoid having to go on to bone marrow transplant. And I do think that this is, I think it's an avenue that I think bears, bears good, exploration. And I think if there are families who are interested, reaching out to the investigators at the company at Minorex, that's Minoryx. That will be if your child has a early stage brain lesion, not yet enhancing, something that may be available. It will require travel to Europe. That's a complicated thing for many people right now in the setting of the pandemic, but that may be something they're considering. And then as we move beyond natural history studies and gene therapy and this Minorex study, we get into studies that are looking at more experimental avenues, mostly around bone marrow transplant. And there are several clinical sites around the country that at Minnesota, at Duke, at Pittsburgh, that have different basically bone marrow transplant regimens that they're exploring. It will look and feel pretty similar to standard care. In many cases, it's optimizing some small features of the standard of care, but many of those sites are also undertaking, some new approaches. It may involve something like changing a chemotherapy agent that's commonly used or something like that. But in terms of what things to look forward to in the next couple of years, there are quite a few companies that have small molecules, meaning kind of just chemicals, essentially, that they're interested in deploying. Among them would be things that can upregulate the ABCD1 sister molecule called ABCD2. These are often thyroid-like hormones, so things that kind of ramp up different parts of your metabolism, and they also ramp up ABCD2. And these will be going into trials, I think, in the next year or two. There are some molecules that are similar to the MIN-102 that will also be going into trials. There's variations of that. And then I've been involved in research around vitamin D, looking at vitamin D's potential to modify metabolism and modify immunity in a way that's favorable for ALD boys. And we've been using it thinking of it as in sort of a preventive fashion, where we completed a pilot study of involving 21 ALD boys aged 18 months to 22 years. And they took vitamin D for 12 months, and we followed several markers, including antioxidant markers in blood and brain, and blood flow measures in the brain, and so on. We've seen some favorable signals suggesting that there was some increase in antioxidant markers in the blood and the brain, and perhaps improved blood flow in the brain. And I would say that the way the study was designed was not designed to determine whether it really worked to prevent lesions. It wasn't designed to determine whether it would, whether it indeed with certainty improved antioxidant status. The primary function of the study was to explore some of these possibilities, and also to find a good dosing regimen for achieving the moderately high doses we were seeking. And so we've recently completed that study, and we're planning to open the next phase of that study. We're currently applying for funding for that now. We're in studies, and if you would say that if you're, we're eager to see how many families might be interested in a study like that, where we would basically be providing access to a vitamin D dosing regimen that we would tailor to patients specifically. And to each person would have a kind of a specific dose we'd tailor to them, and then they would proceed with their routine care with brain MRIs and blood tests for adrenal function. We follow them for over the subsequent years. I know there's been pretty wide interest in this. We hope to make this a formal study. I know it may sound a little strange to say, well, if it's over the counter, why do we need to make it a study? And I think that's a good question. It's a question I'd be asking too. I think the reason is that we really don't know if it works. We think it's a reasonably safe drug once it's taken at reasonable doses. It can be dangerous if the doses are too high. Just want to make sure people understand that you can't overdose on vitamins like vitamin D and vitamin E and vitamin K, and some of these what we call fat soluble vitamins. You can take too much, and it can be hazardous. So you have to take the right amount. That's true of just about everything in life. Is not too little, not too much, but just enough. And that's true of vitamin D too. So a lot of people ask me what dose they should take. It actually depends on your age and weight. So it's hard for me to prescribe a kind of a general dose for everybody, but that is one of the things that we're hoping to test in future studies, is just provide a dose for those who can enroll. We intend to make it very easy to enroll and try and limit travel to potentially eliminate travel altogether for patients who really want to enroll wherever they are. But I will have more information on that soon, and I'll probably we can be happy to discuss that more. But if you are interested, please feel free to reach out to us to just register your interest in a future study. I regret I can't really safely, I can't fairly offer doses to individualize for everyone at this point, but we certainly want to register interest, and if people are want to be in touch for future trials, I'd be happy to take that into account. I'm going to pass this over to Miranda, and I've been talking for I think plenty long here, and I'll filter through some of the questions here. I'll let Miranda talk, and then Miranda and I can try and fill some of these questions together. Okay, take it away, Miranda. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Keith. Hopefully, can you guys see my slides here?
Yes.
Okay, thanks so much. So hi, everyone. My name is Miranda McAuliffe. I'm here on behalf of the ALD Alliance. If there's one thing I want you to know about me today, it's that I am also a newborn screen mom who's learning alongside with all of you. We're about 5 years into our journey since my son was first diagnosed. He was one of the first babies picked up in New York City. So, you know, I take pride in doing my due diligence and staying on top of what the most recent standards of care things are. But when it comes to things like what we talked about in the last two panels, the mental health, the crucial conversations, I might as well have just been diagnosed yesterday. I think these are such important conversations to have. And I just want you all to know that if you're here and you're learning and your head spinning, I'm right there with you. But I'm just so grateful for resources like this that exist now that we didn't have back 5 years ago. So I'm really happy to be here today. I'm here on behalf of Elisa Seeger. So for those of you that aren't familiar with her work, she founded the Aiden Jack Seeger Foundation. And this was after her son Aiden passed away at the age of 7 of adrenoleukodystrophy, after going through the familiar diagnostic odyssey that we've talked about before. He did have a transplant, but unfortunately, because it was a late diagnosis, there were complications. And while she spent approximately 10 months inpatient at his bedside, she was researching this disease and found that, in fact, a newborn screening test did exist for this that no one was utilizing. So she had made that promise to her son at that point that she was going to make sure every baby was tested and that no one would have to go through, what her family went through. And that is how the Aiden Jack Seeger Foundation came to be. And about a year or two ago, changed the name to the ALD Alliance just to welcome, more families, especially the ones that are now coming from newborn screening. So this is our current map of where we stand. This was just updated this week of the states that are screening, states that we hope should be coming on board this year and where efforts have started. What's new, I would say, in 2021 is that the Colorado Board of Health did just unanimously vote that they would start soon implementing ALD screening. It hasn't started yet, but they're hopeful by the end of this year or early next year. And then in terms of states that are in fact testing, that's new as of this year, would be Oklahoma and Maine. For our 3 states, unfortunately, this pandemic, we all know, has just had far-reaching effects in the medical community, but the newborn screening labs also have taken a tremendous hit with this. So both Virginia and Maryland were expected to start already, but they were delayed because of the pandemic. And Missouri, hopefully, the latest I've heard from Julie Persky in Missouri from Knockout ALD is that they should be starting screening this summer. So that's exciting and something to look forward to. Just for a brief history of newborn screening for those that aren't familiar. So Aiden's Law was passed in March of 2013. Thanks to Elisa's efforts, testing began later that year. And as I mentioned, as of today, thanks to Elisa's efforts and the efforts of so many families around the country that have joined forces with her, we do have the 23 states plus DC now testing. So that's kind of the state-by-state look at it. Looking at a national level, for anyone that's done any advocacy work, kind of like the Basics 101, you've probably heard of the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act, which was originally passed in 2008. And this is where a lot of the funding for pilots and research comes, just for these newborn screening tests to be in existence. That has not yet passed for reauthorization, so I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. But I think another important milestone to acknowledge, at least for the ALD community, is that in February of 2016, ALD was added to the Rasp, and that's the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel. This is a huge acknowledgement because any disease that makes it to the Rasp, that's basically the federal government saying, yes, it absolutely makes sense to test these babies for this disease because there is treatment and, you know, well, for us, it's about heartbeats, as I say, the dollars and cents as well, you know, for the cost of the test. Totally makes sense versus what the medical expenses would be afterwards. So why hasn't this reauthorization passed? As I was talking about, the newborn screening saves lives. The short version is there's a lot of people, even in our own community, who don't realize that after the heel is pricked and the blood drop falls on that blood spot card and the baby is screened, there is a life beyond that initial testing. And there's amazing research that is done with these cards. They are de-identified, so there's no way for us to know, you know, which babies these cards came from. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of noise from some privacy advocacy organizations recently expressing concern about this, and it has made its way to Congress and the Senate. So, you know, the downsides to if a potential informed consent, for example, might be needed for parents to say, yes, I'm okay with this blood spot card being used for research. Quite frankly, it could lead to the demise of the wonderful research that has existed. And that's because the cost of an informed consent program would be astronomical, and it could also lead to an underrepresentation of various demographic groups. So this is kind of a hot button issue that's going on right now. And we don't know how it's going to play out yet, but we are watching it closely. And what we're doing at the ALD Alliance to take action on this is we're really trying to educate our community about the importance of these dry blood spots. For those of you that follow us on social media, we did a whole campaign on this last September during Newborn Screening Month, talking about, you know, what these cards mean for families and for the researchers doing this life-saving work. We have also taken a different approach, and that is at the federal level, asking for appropriations language in the federal budget that would actually direct the CDC to fund testing for all conditions that are on this recommended uniform screening panel. So it's not just ALD, it's also Pompe, MPS1, and SMA. So the goal for this appropriations push would be to have all states be RUSP compliant, so all the states testing for these diseases by 2025. And we will still keep working, you know, advocating at a state by state level, but obviously this is a broken system that we're dealing with, you know, that once a disease makes it to this RUSP, it could take up to 10 years on average for all states to be testing, and those are lives lost, and we don't want to see that. So, you know, whether we are working state by state or on this appropriations language, we're going to keep moving forward. And this is just the terminology as it stands in the appropriations language for anyone that's interested. What was helpful is that when we did push this forward, we had the help of Congresswoman Yvette Clarke and Congressman Lee Zeldin. You could see one's a Democrat, one's a Republican. They're both from New York, so it was a bipartisan effort, which is always helpful. And they sent out this Dear Colleague letter, which is awesome because it goes out then to all the members of the House as kind of like a heads up, take a look at this one. And you can see it says support CDC funding to ensure each state has full implementation newborn screening. So for us, that's just eradicating death by zip code. And the way it works, and the people who have helped us with these advocacy efforts know, you could plan for this stuff for a year, and then all of a sudden it's live, and hey, you've got 5 days to reach out to all your congressional representatives to ask them to sign on to this effort. And that's basically what happened earlier this month. So we did have a really great call with a lot of organizations that are listed here today. We put out one-pagers like this that you can find on our website. And we don't just have them for ALD, we do also have them for some of the other diseases that are on the Rasp, because we feel it's important that we partner with them. And so we just found this out earlier this week. I think it was Monday. We did get the list of the congressional representatives that did sign on. So it's 15 in total. We did this for the first time last year. And this is an increase of a few since last year. And we were acknowledged last year. We asked for 15 million. It ended up, I think, being acknowledged with 2 million. So that's a start. It's a precedent. And we're hoping, since we did see some new faces, that will continue on to this year. We do hope to replicate this in the Senate. So Elisa has been in close contact with Senator Gillibrand's office in New York. We would like this to also be a bipartisan effort, as it was in the House. So we are trying to seek a Republican senator as well to sponsor this with her. It's something we're working on. There might be some candidates, but hey, if anyone has any relationships, please feel free to reach out. So some other things that we've been working on or continue to work on is a parent's guide to ALD. So this was something that we launched, I want to say, a year and a half ago at our Standards of Care conference, 2 conferences ago. This was something that was really 6 or 7 years in the making, pretty much from the moment the first baby was tested on newborn screening. We're fortunate right now that there are standards of care guidelines, but the way that this diagnosis is given is not uniform, even now, 7, 8 years after newborn screening being implemented. And unfortunately, that could lead to some really stressful situations. So I was very fortunate when we received the diagnosis. I heard it from a nurse practitioner in a genetics clinic. She set me up right away with my team, from my son, a neurologist, an endocrinologist. We did the genetic counseling almost instantly. And unfortunately, a lot of families receiving this diagnosis, that just isn't the case. Sometimes some people are just given a piece of paper, and sometimes nothing tangible at all. So thanks to Elisa's efforts and some help from Blueprint Bio and ALD Connect, we were able to put this document out. And it's really just a summary for a parent of what the standards of care guidelines should be in a language that we can understand. It is live now on this website, so I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, please check it out. It's such a useful tool, and I really get emotional thinking about how different this would have been, even in our journey, as decent as it was if we had this information out. And I should mention, if you would like a tangible copy, we do have the brochures and we can mail them out, but I would encourage people to kind of use the website only because we can update it as often as we want. And that's really important, especially when it comes to like the ALD experts page, for example. If you wanted to reach out to someone, I want to make sure you're getting the most up-to-date contact information. Another thing we've been working on since our last conference in January is what we're calling the psychological impact of ALD. Again, the last 2 presentations that we heard today, this is something that I think we definitely need to address. And just as we did with the standards of care guidelines, we do want to offer something tangible to families that are going through this. And again, as a parent, so much of what was said today really resonated with me. The fact that there really is no scripts for the right way to deal with this for you and your family. But again, as others had said, just validating that so many before you and right now are going through the same thing. So we had our first call, I think, back in March. We're writing, and we're definitely taking a lot of the information that we learned today and want to incorporate that. And I'm sure we will be having another call soon. And we'd love to welcome as many families as possible that feel they can contribute to this. And then also new this week, we have an app, which is a great way for everyone, I think, to stay on top of the stuff we're working on, especially the legislative stuff, because like I said, the turnaround time is often pretty quick. So here it is. That's the thing where you can scan, or if you'd like, the link is right there. And for this, instant access to the Parents Guide I mentioned, those list of experts, the Save Our Babies petition, which many of you may have seen circulating this week, thanks to a family in North Carolina. You can see videos from our last conference. Like I said, stay up to date on legislative efforts and the events. And then we do plan on releasing the updated newborn screen map that I showed earlier in the presentation. I would think sometime by the end of next week. So for me, it's been super helpful. I love it that, just like I said, in a couple clicks, being able to access the guide, the Save Our Babies petition. I mean, that's something I ask people to sign, obviously, even outside our ALD community. I don't know if it'll translate on here, but it's great. I mean, it's all here. So I would definitely encourage everyone to check that out. It's just another way to stay in touch with us. And I think that's all I have for you guys today. I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much. I think we have 5 or so minutes. I know, Keith, there were definitely some good questions in the chat regarding treatment options. I don't know if you wanted to take a look at those.
Yeah, Kathleen, do you any comments or from you?
I was just going to say,
to
I know we have 5 minutes left, but there are so many good questions that have come in. I think, like, really just in line with what both of you have been talking about, for newborn screening families or newly diagnosed families or people who are just kind of waking up to the ALD community and getting involved, can either of you comment on kind of, I know, well, I'm asking because I know you can comment on different ways to get involved, not only with ALD Alliance, but also ALD Connect and other events, and also the ALD Family Weekend. Maybe you can comment, Keith, and talk about, different ways that people can be involved.
Yeah, let Miranda take the first stab at that. She's been hugely engaged in a lot of things. So any thoughts from you, Miranda? And great talk, by the way. I love the ALD Alliance app. That was really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, we're always looking for help. So it's really just a matter of how you think you would be most helpful. If you live in a state where newborn screening doesn't exist yet, there really, as much as I want there to be, there isn't this perfect formula that we follow and go state by state. It's really different depending on what's going on locally. So by all means, reach out. A lot of times, these legislators, they just need to hear from people that are there in their community and their own constituents for it to resonate and get the ball rolling. So by all means, please reach out with that. And, even beyond ALD Alliance, there's just so many great organizations out there. Kathleen mentioned ALD Family Weekend, which we just took part in. My son had a blast, especially during this pandemic where, we've kind of been so careful and locked in the house. He forms such great connections with the counselors. So please check them out. We had such a good time. The peer mentor program from ALD Connect to connect with other families. There's just so much out there, like I said, that wasn't there initially when we first were diagnosed. And I'm just so grateful to experience it, as a newborn screen parent, and also to be a part of it through the ALD Alliance's community.
Also, I would just recommend on the ALD Connect website, there's a community calendar, and we've been updating it with everything that's going on for as many ALD organizations as want to partner with us and that we can find. So it's not only a place to find out about future ALD Connect programming, but also and conferences, but also to find out about other organizations that are all like, as the tide rises, so do all boats. So we're trying to make sure that if there's a local event near you, share it with us so we can share it with others, and we can kind of allow people to see all the things that are going on in our community.
Great. I think that's a great lead in. Right. And I think in terms of how to get involved, I think find the thing that both maybe fits your skill set and your kind of your needs at the time. I think for parents of young kids, it can be a really challenging time to get heavily engaged. For some people, others, it's water off a duck's back to take on new projects, and some just we all feel compelled in different directions, and so follow the thing that is of greatest interest and passion for you. So whether that's peer counseling or joining a kid camp or something like Ald Family Weekend, something like that. There's just lots of different ways to get involved, and there are really a whole host of nice ALD organizations. ALD Connect website, I think, has Kathleen mentioned, a list of some of them.
Yeah.
A couple questions on testing. So as Kathleen mentioned on the site, yeah, the sibling matched donor would be the gold standard. I think essentially everybody would recommend that if you have a sibling matched donor for an affected ALD child, that would be the go-to choice. And so there's a question about how and when to test for that. So you can talk with you would want to talk with the hematologist or bone marrow transplant specialist in your community, and they would help facilitate that testing. You can test for it really actually at any time. You don't need to wait until there's a lesion to do that in most cases. So you can engage when you feel like it's the right time for you as a family. The transplant itself is not performed unless there's a lesion. So the transplant itself comes with enough risk that we don't transplant preemptively. We only transplant if there's a gadolinium enhancing lesion that's growing. And there were some other really sophisticated questions in here about gene therapy versus traditional bone marrow transplant, and the amount of kind of like correction. And I would still say that maybe just to skirt around some of the technicalities here and the time limited, but sibling matched donor is still the gold standard, and most of us would still recommend that over gene therapy. So if you have that, we would still recommend that as your first choice. Once you get beyond that, I think there are some other considerations, and it does become more complicated in considering what you'd want to choose.
There are so many questions, Keith. I think
yeah,
we have to wrap this up, unfortunately, but I guarantee that we're going to try and get to some of these in the next session if you're able to watch. Thank you both, Miranda and Keith, for really shining a light on how hopeful the future of ALD looks. Like with all this work that's being done, it's not just us. We're not just a patient standing alone, but really there's an entire medical system working to cure our boys and keep us safe and healthy. And there's an entire community of patients and supporters that are also trying to advance work. So thank you both for coming today and spending your afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. If you're watching this live, there is one more link on your agenda. We'll be coming together all together for a community chat. It will no longer be webinar format. Every single one of us will see each other, and we can really, as many of the presenters from earlier in the day that were able to come back will be joining us, and you can have your questions answered. So thank you so much. And if you're watching a video of this, thank you. Reach out to ALD Connect, get involved. Thank you.
Thank you.